All right, let's get going. Welcome. I'm Alice Twemlow, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to the School of Visual Arts, thank you, and to the Department of Design Research, Writing and Criticism. We are accepting applications for the fall, so if you know of people who are interested in the program, or if you're interested yourself, check out the little pink bookmark, which is on some of the seats, which has the URL of our website, which is designresearch.sva.edu, which has lots of information about the program, its faculty, some examples of student work, and of course the important information about how to apply. So yeah, we're well into our spring lecture series now. We've had some really great ones so far. I don't know if you guys were here for the last one. We had Ian Fraser, the New Yorker writer, come talk to us about, well, actually, he could just talk about anything, really, couldn't he? I mean, that's sort of how he felt about it at the end. He was just mesmerizing. But he was talking primarily about sort of evoking a sense of place in his writing, and I was quizzing him about the use of humor in his writing, which is particularly prevalent. Anyway, that was great fun, and if you missed it, you can check out the video on our website, as with all of the others. Okay, so here's my announcement for tonight, which is rough and ready, which is in the spirit of where we are with this. But it's really exciting because we're working on a new project with the students, and it's an exhibition. And we usually have a conference at the end of the year to celebrate the work of our graduating students, but this time we're actually going to translate that into the form of an exhibition called Exploding Footnotes. So mark your calendars for the week of May 11th. We'll be opening on May 11th and then having a series of live events over the course of that week. And it's really fun. And I should actually mention that we've got one of our alumni of the program in the house, Vera Sacchetti, sitting right there. Sorry to draw attention to her, there she is. But she's been, it's lovely to have you back. And she's been working with the students today. She's one of the founding members of the group Superscript, which was formed from some students who graduated from this program. And they have a lot of expertise in putting on crazy exhibitions, so we're getting them to come and do one here. And really, it's based on the idea that often, you know, the findings and insights of years of research in archives and in the field often end up getting really buried in the page footer, condensed into a subdued comment or citation, right? Anyone who's done research knows what I'm talking about here. And this exhibition seeks to expose and examine the research trails, the behind-the-scenes travails, the legwork, the drama, the breakthroughs, doubts, and dead ends that are a part and parcel of in-depth research, but normally end up getting really smoothed over by this kind of linear narrative of scholarly writing. But what we want to do is zero in on these tiny little superscript numerals and all the riches that they contain at the bottom of the page, and basically, you know, celebrate the research process as well as its products. We'll be looking at such topics as piracy and design in the Third Industrial Revolution, the image and the preservation of mid-century domestic architecture, the design district as an agent of urban development and revitalization, changing attitudes toward death and the design of burial containers, the role of rhetoric in influencing the politics and design of New York public housing, the absence of integrated ethics and sustainability instruction in fashion design education, and the material culture of post-utopian space colonies. That's just to give you a little sampler teaser of the kind of subject matter at hand, which, as you can see, is pretty broad, but that's the way we roll here. Also in the audience, I should point out Neil Donnelly, hiding in the back right there, who will be the graphic designer for this exhibition, and working to put together what I'm sure will be a lovely, beautiful, engaging texture display of artifacts, documents, audio, and video, which will serve as a kind of backdrop for a bunch of live critiques, readings, and discussions. So anyway, as you can tell, I'm very excited about this, and I also hope that this will appeal to our speaker tonight, in both in terms of the way it engages with the practice of montage, which will be coming up later, and also in its celebration of the research process, which I know something is very, very dear to his heart. So, I've actually been trying to lure Craig Buckley here for a while. Not only because I find his research interests very intriguing, but also when he was director of publications at the GSAPP program at Columbia, he arranged a series of lectures and directed many fascinating publications that always caught my eye. So it's kind of a sort of two-track interest here. But these days, as you probably know, Craig Buckley is an assistant professor of modern and contemporary architecture in the History of Art department at Yale. He's the editor, most recently, of After the Manifesto, Writing, Architecture and Media in a New Century, which will be published by Columbia University this spring. Then, of course, there's Utopie, Texts and Projects, 1967 to 1978, published by Semiotext and MIT Press, and that was in 2011. And Clip Stampfold, The Radical Architecture of Little Magazines, which is under the ACTAR imprint, and that was in 2010. And you can also find his writing and criticism in journals such as October, Grey Room, Log, and Perspecta, among others. Craig is currently completing a book called Reenvisioning Assembly, Architecture, Montage, and Print Culture in Postwar Europe. And it's that very topic that Craig will address this evening. So please help me welcoming Craig Buckley.
Thank you so much, Alice, for that very kind introduction. Thank you all for coming. As Alice mentioned, this is really a work in progress from a book that I'm preparing. It also emerges out of a sort of a longer-standing interest in the post-war avant-gardes. Indeed, the work that was being done in Europe after the Second World War. And so it emerges out of that, but also out of this new book. So it's nice to be able to get a chance to share work in progress with you. It's also nice to be able to speak to a design audience. I'm usually speaking to art historians and to architects. I thought I would begin not with the 1960s, but really begin with two recent images from the world of architecture, more or less chosen at random. The image on the left was recently acquired by the Museum of Modern Art, and the one on the right is under construction downtown. What do we see in these two different images? On the left, a slab of a building sits on what appears to be an abandoned parking lot or maybe the site of some demolished mall. It sits on a row of nondescript garages of the kind you might find in any suburban outskirt. It has 18 horizontal floor plates that rise above, completely monotonous, completely regular, the kind of generic high-rise that one could find in any place whatsoever. Yet within these floors, a riot of different windows and wall types, stair shafts, balconies, unidentified protuberances. On the right, we see a very different kind of image, a closer view, a rendering, an urban street scene. People approach a building. Here the facades are uniform, but the floor plates are not regular. They advance and recede, they push and pull, they stack and pile, a little bit like children's blocks. Both images are, of course, fully constructed in the circuits of the computer, yet they move in entirely different directions. Philippe Dujardin's fictions begin with photographs taken in the world and then are minutely stitched together in order to create a kind of monstrous hybrid. Herzog and Demeron begin with a monstrous hybrid and then look to insert it within an existing site. And I feel like these two images are somehow almost topologically connected, two facets of the way in which the rendering and the photograph have come so close together that it's hard now to often tell them apart. The overall effect tends to be one about smoothing, of polish and shine. In Dujardin's photos, this produces something quite surreal. In the space of the real estate rendering, paradoxically, the more perfectly that fiction aims to reflect a world that we might recognize as our own, the less room seems to be left in it for us. And this is, I think, one of the conditions facing us today. If you look at the poor chap here, you notice his reflection doesn't appear in the Anish Kapoor, neither does the street. There's sort of no more capacity for reflection there. It's become a truism of sorts that an increasingly seamless capacity to cut, paste, sample, and assemble an ever-growing range of still and moving images has become the dominant, or an increasingly dominant mode in global visual culture. As architecture has embraced a recent expansion of its own computational design tools in recent decades, its capacity to search, retrieve, and combine image fragments into new ensembles has grown similarly prevalent and ubiquitous. Yet as this has happened, I think, our sense for the deeper history of these composite visual forms has somehow atrophied and actually receded from consciousness, melding into a kind of pop curatorial patois of mashups and cut and paste. And I think it's telling that when MoMA, the architecture department at MoMA, decided to mount an exhibition of its collage and montage work, it called it cut and paste. It didn't use these older terms or older concepts. Narratives of the digital turn in architecture invariably highlight the eclipse of print-based culture and its displacement by media forms that are based in light, based in movement, shifting away from the reproduction of identical copies to embrace a theoretically endless generation of mutations and variabilities. These narratives of rupture and transformation overlook, I think, what is an important persistence of visual forms rooted in 20th century print culture, forms that continue to exert, I think, a very powerful influence over our engagement with this supposedly new media. And a historical understanding of those dynamics allows us, I would argue, to think through and to read more closely these composite visual assemblages, and to grapple with the visual and ideological roles that they play in architectural culture in our own time, a time, of course, of shifting media regimes. So today, one of the arguments I'd like to make is that montage, in fact, remains a crucial concept for understanding the longer history of architecture's ever-deepening immersion in photomechanical media. Digital montages of the type that I started with are not an external representation of architecture. In fact, montage is not a tool for creating illusory verisimilitude. It's actually one of the most crucial spaces in which design is taking place today, and therefore we need to understand it better. Concepts of montage have, of course, been associated with a wide range of literary, cinematic, and artistic practices across the 20th century. And I'm going to focus just on one dimension today, and that's the intimate link between montage and questions of assembly, a process in which the decomposition, alteration, and recombining of photographic material is understood somehow as analogous to mechanized industrial processes. This was the complex, I think, that helped fuel montage through most of the 20th century. Practices of montage have typically been associated with avant-garde photography and film, yet they've also played an important, if underappreciated, role in the development of modern architecture. And whereas much scholarly effort has sought to retrace the invention of montage, returning to the pivotal years of the 1920s, the historical avant-gardes, things like you see here, Hannah Hoch's photo collages made in the Dada movement of the early 1920s, cut literally from newspapers and magazines, or the more reproducible material of Rodchenko, who was making photo montages and introducing them into magazines like Lief in the Soviet Union in the early 1920s. This is where much of the work has been done. Ideas of shock and defamiliarization were, of course, fueling the montages of the historical avant-garde, and as these progressively came to be absorbed into mass culture through things like exhibitions, political propaganda, films, magazine layouts, and advertisements, practices of montage evolved and shifted, incorporated into the workings of commerce and entertainment. And if the specificity of montage has been eclipsed today by the tendency to speak about cut and paste rather than montage and collage, historians, for their part, have often consigned montage to a particular moment in the past as well, and that's something I'd like to question. They've largely tried to situate it between the two world wars. This argument was pioneered in an important way by figures such as Peter Berger or Manfredo Tafuri in the 1970s, whose critiques of the post-war avant-gardes of their own time saw them as emptied repetitions of the more radical, if also doomed, historical avant-gardes of the 1920s. So rather than invention followed by incorporation, co-optation, and evacuation, I think it's important to think a little bit more today about the untimely persistence of montage, the fact that it is still lingering with us as a set of visual forms that grew up in the age of the printed image and whose afterlife still haunts us. The persistence of montage remains, I think, more complex, differentiated, and resilient than these other schemas might allow. The book, therefore, turns to a slightly later moment, not the 1920s, but in fact the long 1960s, roughly 1958 to 1973, in order to examine what is, in fact, an an intense elaboration of this visual form across architectural culture. It looks at the construction of a wide range of composite images from magazine pages, magazine layouts, to exhibitions, competitions, and films produced by a range of architectural groups based in London, Vienna, Florence, and Paris. In London, I examined the outskirts, in a sense, of the independent group, figures like John McHale, Edward Wright, and Theo Crosby, through a number of important exhibitions and buildings and magazine covers of the 1950s. Their younger proteges, almost progeny, the Archigram group, that appear in the early 1960s, both through the magazine that they create and through a number of crazy exhibitions, indeed, like Living City and Instant City later in the decade. In Vienna, I look at a cluster of figures working around a magazine called Bau, the work of Hans Hollein, Walter Pichler, and Gunther Feuerstein, both for Hollein's intensive engagement with photomontage through things like his famous aircraft carrier in the landscape, to a series of small boutiques in the city, small interventions, small shops, which have this same type of cutting into the facade of the city, breaking apart from the context. And finally, looking at the rise of the radical architects in Florence during these years, Archizoom and Superstudio, notably through their turn to film and through their turn to various installation practices, all of which depended quite heavily on montage. If groups like these shared a visual idiom, they also remained quite different ideologically. Taken together, they create a type of cross-section, one in which the relays and continuities of montage's survival, as well as moments of conflict and rupture, can be detected. Architects during these years, I think, struggled to both assimilate but also to critically engage the persistent demand for architecture's imageability, that architecture become convertible in image form, a problem that was especially acute during the 1960s, a period of intensified consumer culture, but also of rapid changes in thinking about industrialized building. So practices of manipulating and combining photographic material, of course, appear outside of the historical avant-garde as well. They don't begin in the 1920s, just to mention a couple of examples. And many of you may have seen the exhibition at the Met last year, Faking It, which tried to reach back into the 19th century. There's a long history of collage in the Victorian era. You're looking at one here from the Smithsonian. There's also the type of tall tale postcards at the turn of the century, both sites in which the precursors of montage began to appear. In architecture, already by the turn of the century, we see composites of photography, drawing, and other materials that were being made for competitions. This one from the Munich architect Friedrich von Tirsch for a new spa in 1902, a really early example of montage being developed for competition. But these type of images, I think, were not yet understood as montages. It's only in the 1920s that we get the practice of combining photographic material understood and named as montage. To understand that transformation, I think it helps to think a little bit about the etymology of the term itself. In the 18th century, the definition of montage from the French verb monter, to climb, to lift, or to elevate, denoted only the elevation of goods by barge or by animal power. It's only through the course of the 19th century that the definition of montage expanded to include the sense of construction, assembly, and erection, notably in references to the making of buildings. And it's only in the early 20th century that montage expands from building construction to include mechanized industrial assembly and reproduction. And it's this particular shift of meaning that was crucial to the artists and filmmakers associated with Dada and constructivism, who seized it to liken photomechanical materials with industrial building materials, modeling their own type of activity on the type of work being carried out by fitters, by engineers, and by technicians. It's also at this moment, and I think it's not a coincidence, that architects begin to engage it in a different way. An architect like Mies van der Rohe introduces his conception for a glass skyscraper by means of photomontage in 1921, a pivotal work in which a changed attitude both to photographic materials and a changed attitude to the assembly of steel and glass somehow come to meet each other in a way that would leave an enduring imprint on the architectural imaginary for decades. I think it's important to remember that Mies would not get anywhere near building a glass skyscraper until the late 1940s. It's only 20 or more years later, but it's projected already through the means of montage in the early 1920s. So by highlighting this etymological link between montage and assembly, I'd also like to argue that problems of assembly have a more unsettled place in the 20th century architectural culture than we typically recognize. Works of architecture have grown across the century into increasingly complex, challenging, and specialized assemblages of design, capital, techniques, materials, and human beings. Such assemblages, however, are never simply available to consciousness. They must be envisioned. To re-examine montage, then, is to probe how architects have envisioned assembly, how they've envisioned assemblages, how they've sought to make them visible to the public, to each other, and to themselves. Such envisioning of assembly both troubles and, I think, seduces architecture in interesting ways. On the one hand, as the links between architecture and the things and processes outside of it, as they grow more complex, the idea of architecture as an autonomous and self-defined domain of cultural practice becomes more vulnerable. And yet, the concern to renew architectural practice during the long 1960s was continually fascinated with technological problems of attachment and detailing, reveling in clips, in plugs, in cranes and lifts, to the extent that architecture seemed to merge at times into an accumulation of technical detail. It's for that reason, I think, that montage became such a potent and charged mode of envisioning assembly during these years, one that also provides, in a sense, a symptomatology of the tensions that architects and that architecture have had to manage then and since. And tonight I will just present sort of a chapter from the book, one that comes out of France, out of the Utopie group, because I think they highlight an interesting case of the way in which montage is changing and how it's being deployed during these years. For those of you who don't know who they were a group who worked together for roughly a decade, beginning in 1967. Their most intense period of collaboration was between 67 and 70. It was a very hybrid formation. It included architects, Jean Aubert, Isabelle Auricoste, Jean-Paul Jungmann, and Antoine Stenko. But it also included sociologists like Jean Baudrillard and René Leroux, both of whom were students of Henri Lefebvre at the University of Nanterre. And it included urban planners and urbanists, Catherine Coe and Hubert Tonka. And a key context for the formation of the group was the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the venerated capital of architectural design since the beginning of the 19th century, which, like other architecture schools at this moment, enters into a very deep-seated legitimation crisis, one that culminates in the school's closing during the occupations of May of '68, a moment in which the student body actually votes to dissolve the School of Architecture and ends the tradition, giving rise to several new schools that start in 1969. So it's a very, very stark moment of conflict and one that dramatically remakes architectural pedagogy in France. The group forms in this context, and in their work we see an intensive, if short-lived, effort to decipher architecture's position, not only in the École des Beaux-Arts, but in a landscape remade by new forms of industrial production, by the intensification of post-war consumer society, but also to construct what they called a theoretical practice, one that connected intellectual work on and through contemporary media, the making of the journal, the way in which they actually put together media for circulation, experiments with architectural structure, in fact, a deep interest in continuing experiments with building, and the development of a different intellectual vocabulary for the field. All of those come together. Particularly important in this context is the way in which the status of montage was reframed. In particular, there's stress not only on putting together, but on taking apart, the industrial fragmentation that is, in a sense, the precondition for assemblage. It is a shift highlighted, I think, by the group's frequent recourse to the verb démonter, to disassemble or to dismantle, which comes up again and again in their writings. Writing shortly after the events of May 1968 in the magazine Architecture Aujourd'hui, you see how even in their articles you have this juxtaposition of theoretical text on the one hand in the interior columns and these visual montages in the exterior columns. There's always somehow working together, the image and the writing. In this article they write, "We must dismantle the economic, political, social, and cultural manifestations of architecture and in a second movement attempt to penetrate subjective appearances and ideological illusions in order to comprehend architecture's role and status as the result and product of a society. A dense, involuted sentence reflecting the kind of period vernacular in a sense. But disassembly plays a key role in that sentence, and it lends itself to a range of potential readings. We could hear in it something like unmounting, an object taken down from its pedestal, or even more violently, something dismounted, like a rider from a horse. Démontage, disassembly, equally recalls the broader circulation of the prefix dé, on or dis, in French avant-garde circles after the war. Thinking here, of course, of Raymond In's use of décollage to describe his practice of exhibiting anonymously torn billboards, which he collected from Parisian streets in the 50s and 60s, or perhaps even more famously, the Situationist International, their use of the term détournement to theorize the strategic misappropriation of everyday materials, using comics and recaptioning them was for them détournement, a type of strategic misuse of material. But I think disassembly, in fact, is different from both of these. It's neither a violent tearing of the image's surface, nor is it a deliberate program of misuse, but rather it suggests the intricate task of taking apart. Disassembling what they called the manifestations of architecture was an effort to theorize architecture's relationship to images differently, to dislodge certain definitions that had been centrally ensconced in the vocabulary of the Beaux-Arts, the dominant one in their context. Architecture, they argued, could not be understood as a work of art, a creation, or a synthesis, as the more conservative wing of the school still wanted to maintain. But nor did it suffice, as certain slogans of the ex-Beaux-Arts, the more political left-wing militants within the school, would have it, to define architecture as, quote, a service to the people, or, quote, simply a political act. In contrast to all of those definitions, disassembly can be seen as a conceptual apparatus that sought to comprehend, quote, the moments of transformation of a commodity called architecture in the course of its production in the heart of French society. That is what they're looking to take apart and to understand. If ideology can be understood as an imaginary relationship to the real, as Althusser famously theorized at this very moment, the group's interest in disassembly saw that relationship as a type of mechanism, one that could be understood, perhaps even arrested, by taking it apart. And it's this mania for disassembly that I think allows us to read the visually dense pages of their journal as effort to decompose architecture's position in the commodity culture of the 1960s, but also to analyze their preoccupations with lightweight inflatable structures, objects in which they're also working on at the end of the 1960s. To put this in some architectural context, I think it's interesting that this interest in disassembly emerges within a particular segment of the École des Beaux-Arts, notably the studio of a man named Édouard Albert. Édouard Albert is responsible for buildings like this, the Tour Coulebab, which was realized in 1960. Albert was a pioneer in steel construction, and particularly in tubular steel construction, not I-beams like we use here in the States, but tubular steel, which you can see there, which is light and is in fact designed so that it can be taken apart. In fact, used often in industrial conditions. He adapted this for housing at the beginning of the 1960s, and it's in Albert's atelier that Stenko and Aubert and Jungmann meet each other. The atelier was huge, had hundreds of students. It was also very porous. They could invite in other figures from the outside. They would have guests like Jean Prouvé, master of modern design in steel, lightweight construction. The atelier was also open to a range of misfits and other figures like David George Emmerich, a Buckminster Fuller-like figure who was very much interested in lightweight structures and who came to be the advisor of Aubert, Jungmann, and Stenko on their thesis projects in 1967. Some traces of this intellectual environment, I think, begin to appear in the pages of the journal itself. We're looking here at a page of an article by Jean Aubert called Becoming Outmoded in the journal's first issue. Cutting and pasting photographs and text fragments from a variety of magazines and books, Aubert configured a series of visual tables that aimed to map out the opposition between the ephemeral and the durable in contemporary architecture. The ephemeral was populated with a range of structures from exhibitions and displays, yet under the heading durable, he assembled a different constellation of references, ranging from archaic pyramids to a remarkable cross-section of brutalist buildings, which are, of course, then at the very height of fashion, ranging from forgotten pieces like Henri Bernal's Maison de la Radio in France to things like Paul Rudolph's Yale Art and Architecture building, where I get to look at every day, still there and gloriously refurbished, unlike the Orange County Center, which is on its way to demolition. But if one looks closely at the center of this field, in fact, we see that demolition is there at its heart, right there. At the center, we see not brutalist buildings, but an image of the Gare Montparnasse, already partly dismantled in 1967, evocatively positioned next to the phrase, "the long and difficult demolition of buildings built for eternity." Montparnasse, like its more famous cousin, Les Halles, was one of the old 19th century steel structures, iron structures, in fact, that was being demolished to make way for the new infrastructure that was entering into the center of Paris. And I think this demolition is in the background of the group's interest, not in heavy things, but in light things, in actually working with air, and working with material that's almost ephemeral. On the left-hand side of the same spread, we find another reference to demolition, this one from a manifesto by their teacher Emmerich, who called for a different type of demolition, one that would replace, quote, buildings built under the regime of durability with more ephemeral constructions. Emmerich's idea of ephemeral construction argued for industrially produced systems that were light and easy to disassemble, and that could be redeployed and changed according to the needs of the inhabitants. You're looking here at a somewhat crazy proposal for a set of structural elements that could be used to create lightweight vehicles, but also be used to create dome structures and cupola from which you could suspend various dwelling units, as you see in the side of the cupola there. He was very much interested in a type of almost self-built architecture during these years, using high-tech means to achieve it. While seemingly modest and inconspicuous when you contrast this with the more ponderous side of architectural culture, the heavy concrete brutalist buildings of the same years, this lightweight, demountable architecture actually harbored, I think, a much greater ambition to recognize and even potentially control architecture's own obsolescence at a moment of accelerated and uncertain urban change. Questions of obsolescence and change were also probed in the journal at the level of the commodity, not only at the level of these larger architectural frameworks, a field that was registered via the contemporary aesthetics of industrial design, in particular through a reflection on product styling. Architect Antoine Stenko's contribution to the first issue took the form of a visual atlas. These two, I would argue, are montages. They may not look like the ones that we're familiar with, but each spread is an assemblage of material cut from the pages of different magazines like Domus and Art International, furniture exhibition catalogs, fashion magazines, popular cultural weeklies, all of which are embedded alongside blocks of texts from historians such as Giulio Carlo Argan, Pierre-Franck Estel, and Arnold Hauser, many of the sort of sociologically oriented art historians of that period. And I think it's important to try and read not only photo montages, but these type of atlas-like configurations as montages, ones that are, in a sense, strangely still with us. What can one read on a page like this one? What do we see? Toward the bottom, our eye might be caught by the image of a 1964 Ford Thunderbird. Above it, a sketch by Michelangelo. Over to the left, a bronze version of Brancusi's 1923 sculpture, Bird in Space. A mess of lines, which is in fact a pile of mass-produced handles. Advertisements for Telefunken portable transistor radios and for Philishave electric razors. A line of women assembling goods at a high-tech, very high-tech looking for 1967 assembly line. A piece of furniture by Joe Colombo. An object of some sort, I can't tell which, by Raymond Loewy. Space race fashions inspired, of course, by Pierre Cardin, himself an architecture student during these years, mid-1960s. Is it Dutch oven? Great. I will. It's the benefits of talking to a design audience. I will include that next time. The seemingly incongruous juxtapositions between Renaissance art and post-war cars that we see at the bottom of the page were in fact not made up by Stenko. These were cut from a particular source. You see that happening here. The source was the 1964 Ford Book of Styling. The document laid out the corporation's styling principles as a visual essay, running from ancient chariots all the way to the latest models on Ford's drafting boards. Their own diagrammatic timeline conveyed their own sense of styling's evolution. From the 1930s to the 1960s, styling programs did not only add elements to automobiles, they in fact targeted the automobile's seams, smoothing over differences between bumpers, headlights, wheel wells, and engine compartments, replacing the assembled mechanical appearance of the old Model T with a type of unity, what Ford called a unity of design, a single overall streamlined form. The curving, flaring lines of post-war dream machines changed not only the car, but the very look of assembly. The smoothing of transitions between formerly separate parts found its complement, I would say, in a visual rhetoric that drew together a disparate range of image references, from Caravaggio to Moore to the 1964 Ford Thunderbird. Here you're seeing an amazing page from the styling manual in which the swirling lines of Caravaggio's The Entombment of Christ from 1604 is compared, in fact, to the stylist's efforts to direct the eye to create the lines of the Ford Thunderbird, to produce a feeling of visual motion within an otherwise static object. You see how the same codes here are actually transposed into the lines of the Thunderbird. Excuse me. The Ford Thunderbird here is pitched not so much as an artwork, but as a type of commodity that overcame the opposition between the limitations of standardized mass production and the exclusiveness and uniqueness of the art object. Styling was an object language for the 20th century that could overcome this dilemma between standardization on the one hand and uniqueness on the other, but it was also a kind of meta-language, an effort to teach consumers how to read design, an attempt at the same time to hold together the Ford brand identity as it grew ever more complex and differentiated, an association that had to be sustained across an ever wider range of images and objects. The styling guide, in a sense, is, I think, a primer for this type of visual literacy in the 1960s. And it's interesting then that Stenko, this architect in Paris, is looking directly at this, and not only looking at it, but cutting it out and assembling it onto the pages of his magazine. His visual universe, in a sense, parallels that of the styling book, yet its juxtapositions of automobiles, household goods, furniture, and art, I'd say, does something quite different. It takes apart and even short-circuits the techniques for visual rhyming and verbal direction that were found within these types of styling guides. The automobiles, chairs, and appliances found themselves juxtaposed with views onto larger apparatuses of production and assembly, including schools and factories, kiosks and cinemas, vacation resorts, and suburban grands ensembles. Whereas the juxtapositions within the Ford Guide evoked analogies and similarities across the broad sweep of history, Stenko's atlas stressed blank spaces, gaps, collisions, and unresolved associations. The pages announced their sources as the shifting world of printed matter itself, attached to fragments of headlines and journal citations, appearing as so many clippings laid out on a table. Indeed, the very space in which the intersection of language, the very sort of space, as Foucault had argued in 1966, the table formed the place in which language and space could come together in order to render entities comparable. On the final page of Stenko's article, the one that follows this one, the table that juxtaposed automobiles, design objects, furniture, and interiors abruptly disappears. The idealized world of the automobile and automotive form collides abruptly with urban space, encountering an accumulation of automobiles in a traffic-clogged Parisian street. Stenko envisions the city as a movement in a way that contrasts sharply with other efforts to envision Paris's technological transformation during these years, also carried out by means of montage, such as those, as you see here, conceived by the architect Jona Friedman. There, the city appears as a ground over which a new promise of technological coherence was projected, an architectural framework defined by a visual and technical overlay flying above the roofs of the old city. Instead, in the montage of Stenko, the reader is confronted with what at first appears to be a single street scene, but which on closer inspection can be seen to be composed of two separate photographs, distinct views of dense urban traffic near the Gare du Nord. Several smaller photographs are overlaid on a set of Several smaller photographs are overlaid onto the larger images, interrupting the impression of a singular scene, and they provide a set of fleeting glimpses into discontinuous spaces. A partly disassembled car in a repair shop, mass goods lined up along storefronts, a dense visual surface of advertisements accumulated on hoardings, a view from a bus. Once again, though, and I'd say in a very different manner, the relationship between the circulation of commodities and images and the physical circulation of people and objects is being envisioned. The opposition between closeness and distance on the page appears outside of any stable perspectival space. Rather, the viewer must isolate disjunctive views, prying them out of a dense photomechanical surface, putting them together in his or her mind. The architect contrasted the rapid pace of technological development to the stability of architecture and urbanism, which had stayed the same for so long. He writes underneath this image, apart from the object and its mobile, ephemeral aspect, the problems of technology and industrialization present themselves completely upside down. How is it that despite the techniques available to us in this domain, we remain at the stage of coarse productions and distant prospects? This is the voice of a frustrated architect in 1967. The most optimistic enthusiasts of post-war industrial society believed that new techniques of mass production promised inherently new forms of mobilité, a term in French whose connotation includes literal movement, but also class mobility, as well as cultural changeability and versatility of mind and hand. The assembly that Stenko presents indicates less a fulfillment of such promise than its lack. In the domains of architecture and urban space, mobility appears upside down in the old sense that Marx had used in his description of ideology as a camera obscura that in fact inverts the way we see things normally. It's less a fluid movement and versatility, in fact, than a space of stoppage and inflexibility, a visual and literal traffic jam of cars, billboards, hoardings, newspaper kiosks, and repair shops. Stenko, like many of the other architects in Utopie, were not, however, dismissing the potential of technological development. In fact, the group's simultaneous work on pneumatic structures evinced a fascination with emerging technologies, one in which their interest in disassembly was conjugated into the design of demountable systems. And this is the crazy exhibition part. You'll get to see their crazy exhibition of 1968. Pneumatics, not unlike other media that they were using, such as offset lithography for the making of their magazine, was conceived for rapid reproducibility in potentially unlimited copies. Pneumatics, like magazines, could be directly put together, taken apart, and disposed of by the users themselves. The group's interest in pneumatics came to wide public attention through Structures gonflables, or inflatable structures, an exhibition and set of meetings that took place at Paris's Museum of Modern Art for 4 weeks in March in 1968. Photographs of the installation, like the one that you see here, show an interior that sought to overwhelm the visitor, with interiors densely packed as the elements that were arranged on Utopie's pages. The pneumatic objects appear at many times to perform their lightness, appearing in mid-air. I think they relish the kind of uncomfortable quality of having this exhibition in the Museum of Modern Art. It was actually the very first time that the Museum of Modern Art of Paris had shown something other than art, had shown design objects, technical objects. And it's, I think, telling that pneumatics make that first entry into the museum, notably through things like the way in which they've wedged that weather balloon into, or the dirigible, into the hallway there. The exhibition included many things, not only weather balloons and dirigibles, but kinetic sculptures, furniture, Andy Warhol's Mylar clouds, high-altitude pressure suits, and even more. Supporting these provisional encounters was a distinctly un-pneumatic apparatus of metal scaffolding that snaked through the exhibition space, a type of orthopedic for this rather chaotic pneumatic field. You see here the extent of that apparatus during the installation. The armature also supported a dense layer of technical information. You see a detail of that there. This ran through the entire exhibition, and it included materials, operating pressures, manufacturers, dimensions, and availability. These panels, together with the accompanying catalog, were created by writing to manufacturers. They actually wrote to them and called them in order to solicit a vast amount of information and even to get the demonstration objects for the exhibition itself. The array of objects on display was also an assemblage of different agents, including such things as 2,000-liter flexible oil and gas storage tanks used in the petroleum industry, pneumatic bridges designed and developed by the military, undersea exploration vessels, and various types of high-altitude weather balloons, such as the Echo 1 Mylar reflector satellite designed by NASA, PVC sculptures designed and produced by artists, as well as things like pneumatic cinema environments that appeared at the same time, and such things as anti-radiation suits, which are also being developed using pneumatic technology. So in short, a really strange and wild gamut of things that pneumatics were doing in 1967-68. I would say that the exhibition used pneumatics, in a sense, as a Trojan horse, exploring not technology in some abstract sense, nor a particular object, but to grasp the state of a technical cultural assemblage, one defined by the ways in which materials, industries, and manufacturing were connected to a larger cultural system. It was this larger cultural system that Utopie sought to decode, but they also sought to enter it, which meant with members of the group actually developing their own designs for pneumatic furniture during these years. Pneumatics was a technique that was both seemingly open to appropriation and yet strangely resistant to it. Composed of welded sheets of plastic and rubber, pneumatic structures depended on the minute integrity of every inch of their seams, a pressurized system in which even the most minute discontinuity threatened leakage, deformation, and collapse. In the group's designs for furniture systems, these discontinuities were multiplied, albeit in a different form. Rather than design a single piece of pneumatic furniture, say a pneumatic chair, the group actually conceived of distinct pneumatic parts that could be assembled and disassembled in different ways by users. I think this is telling, the way in which, in a diagram like this, the various components can be used to form different furniture elements. It speaks to their obsession with assembly and disassembly, that they're not actually producing an inflatable chair of the type that were normally produced in 67, 68. They're producing a type of inflatable system here, an assembly object that could be determined by the users, redirecting, in fact, the more amorphous qualities of pneumatics and of plastics towards something more like a taut geometrical logic of structure, something that both drew on and I think exacerbated the teaching of their teachers, Emmerich and Albert. The relationship between technological developments and post-war consumer culture was not only taking place in the exhibition, it was also at the center of work being done by someone like Jean Baudrillard at this time, whose book, The System of Objects, which I assume it might be quite familiar to many design students, was published the same year as the exhibition. Post-war consumer culture, Baudrillard argued, could no longer be grasped at the level of an individual object, but had to be understood as a larger system of objects, one in which inessential differences amongst things were more thoroughly, quote, systematized by the production process itself. Baudrillard, like Stenko, sought to theorize this in part by examining the world of industrial styling. He looked to understand the dialectical interaction between a dynamic and unpredictable structure of technological development on the one hand, and a cultural structure on the other that arrested, organized, and codified technology into systems of form. Adding a new dimension to Marx's concept of commodity fetishism, Baudrillard posited an object that was not turned on its head, but internally divided, whose external surfaces performed in a manner largely determined by the signifying agendas of advertising and communication, rather than according to the logic of assembly that guided its internal mechanisms. If the outside of objects were alarmingly discontinuous from their internal workings, the increasingly minute design of their plastic surfaces enunciated a compensatory rhetoric of control, one that operated via shape, promising an ability to manipulate forms of power that lay, in fact, ever more thoroughly beyond human grasp. Full of unresolved collisions, the exhibition Inflatable Structures was one whose disposition did not seem to have been entirely determined. A heterogeneous set of technological possibilities that in fact laid at the limits of architectural culture and thus lacked anything like a coherent code. In this sense, it was less a system of objects in Baudrillard's sense than a breach or a blind spot within it. Laying claim to their teacher Henri Lefebvre's slogan, all technology at the service of everyday life, the group sought to envision other uses for such techniques, ones which carried the promise of disrupting the reigning order of things. Not unlike the contemporaneous emergence of cheap and changeable standardization in pop music or fashion during these years, for a brief moment, pneumatics promised a similarly radical instability, a vector for accelerating the decomposition of inherited cultural codes by connecting them to the unpredictable effects of emerging technologies. It would be a mistake, however, to imagine the group as techno-utopians. If they valued the disruptive potential of technology, to use a much overhyped word, disruption, they also recognized the forces of culture and class as powerful impediments to any change in social norms. And I think this conflict appears in the last example that I'm going to show you today, a few pages that were put together by the sociologists in the group, Hubert Tonka and René Leroux, titled simply Repression. Disposable plastic commodities appear here too. We see sunglasses, vinyl raincoats, and ready-to-wear fashion, all images plucked from the French press during these years. This particular spread was assembled from the contrast between ads, slogans, and headlines drawn from popular magazines and newspapers, and then added to it photographs of housing complexes and sparsely populated streets, as well as more regular blocks reserved for columns of text. The text, which you see here on the right, actually came from an obscure journal edited by the Parisian police named Liaison, describing a range of new initiatives for urban policing at the time. The gaps which we saw in the atlas by Antoine Stenko here seem to have collapsed, and they've actually come closer together. The density of the visual and verbal mosaic pushes you continually back and forth between reading and seeing, and I think they were very much interested in that confusion. The montage here assembles a kind of hybrid image writing, or assembles image and writing together. It was an odd mixture, one conversant on the one hand with notions of écriture drawn from structuralist criticism, while simultaneously geared towards do-it-yourself processes of layout within the emerging free press movement. Defying the unified logic of an author, such pages implied processes of meaning production that were skeptical of individual creation. These were often literally realized by more than one person at a time. That was a principle within the magazine. And they explored, instead of individual creation, the meaning effects produced by creating and altering relationships between pre-existing elements of mass communication, dismantling and, in a sense, reassembling forms of legibility that you could find in architectural journals or mass cultural publications. And before drawing out a little bit about how this disassembly might be read in a spread like this and how we might read it in relationship to theories of the image at that time, I wanted to emphasize how pages like this were made, because I think that's quite important. The rise of these layered montages in architectural culture appears at a moment when a new set of technologies for reproducing the page are coming onto the scene. Utopie was produced by means of offset lithographic printing, as were most of the other little magazines of the groups which I am studying. And it was increasingly accessible in the early 1960s as a retail reproduction service. It offered a cheap alternative, in a sense, to traditional letterpress. The production of illustrated graphic layouts in industrial letterpress had relied on a complex division of labor. A layout would be specified by a designer, and the selected material, drawings and photographs, text, would then be copied, prepared, and etched by a team of process engravers. The resulting image plates would then be composited or made up with blocks of type which had been set by typesetters, and then they would be finally printed by still another group. The pre-press process of offset litho, by contrast, was greatly reduced. With offset litho, architects could bring in could combine text, clippings, photos, drawings, and screen tone directly on a piece of cardboard known as a paste-up. A paste-up could then be brought to the printer, who would then photomechanically capture it and then run it off in his miniaturized offset press alongside commercial flyers and other type of disposable ephemera from the time period. These were the types of jobs that were brought to these machines. With such descaling, I think we have montage moving from being a rather specialized activity, a province of the avant-garde, to becoming an intimate part of how the space of the page was conceptualized by a wider range of actors, sociologists, architects, you name it. This is the paste-up here that was used to create the page that we've been looking at, and it provides a kind of intriguing window onto the way in which this page was organized. Material to be reproduced in black and white was captured on one screen. You see that available there on the paste up. Material that was going to be in having gray tones would have been captured via a separate halftone screen. The form of the separation was coordinated around a series of negative spaces. You see them there and there. And it's within, on the one hand, there's a very economical reason for doing this. By ganging up the different types of material, you would actually save money. But there's also a type of semantic dimension. There's an idea behind this as well. You notice how they've separated out the black and white material, which consists of advertisements and text, from the images of the city beyond, which appear in grayscale. So they're right next to each other, but in fact, they're operating in different registers, in different orientations. This consciousness of different optical layers within offset litho, I think, can be considered in relationship to a changing idea about the image at this moment, which is often seen as not a picture, but as an internally layered structure. We see that perhaps most explicitly in Roland Barthes's work in his 1964 essay, The Rhetoric of the Image, where he proposed to use structuralist methods to decompose the ideological structure of advertising images. Such images, he argued, operated through a series of layered messages, defined by a particular interaction of denotative and connotative signs. The connotative polysemic density of the image, he argued, was like, quote, an architecture of signs, drawn from a variable depth of lexicons. Such an architecture of signs, he noted, was composed of the interaction of discontinuous connotative elements, shapes, colors, surface textures, which were like, quote, erratic blocks isolated and mounted into a general scene by the apparatus of denotation. In Barthes's analysis, even the most disposable and banal of images, think for instance of his analysis of the tomato sauce ad, the famous Panzani ad, they come to appear as an instance of a more general ideological edifice, a structural assemblage in which the dispersive, discontinuous, and erratic forces of connotation are somehow locked into place and made to perform denotatively, fixed and mounted like a facade. Répression, by contrast, scrambles this polarized structure. Familiar signifying materials are taken apart and put back together in ways that challenge our capacity to make meaning from them. This only intensifies all of the connotative energy of all manner of liaison, from the information chains of urban policing to the images of suspenders, clip bras, and the patterned facades of industrial buildings, highway clover leaves, and the cables of movable cranes. Signs are not isolated and mounted to reliably denote a particular referent, but detached from disparate sources and joined into new connotative blocks. Language no longer holds the image like a vice, as Barthes argued, but it has become itself a kind of visual surface. We see here a logo of links from a chain which is drawn from Elle magazine, which appears next to the abstract image of a knot, which is, of course, the Woolmark logo, which was actually designed in 1966. These contrasting curves appear next to an advertisement for spray deodorant, itself an entirely new commodity at the time. This aerosol link carries over into a reference to combiné, which could refer to the corselet pictured above, but also to telephone handsets and receivers. A contiguous circuit continues right and left, up and down. We even see arrows here pointing us back and forth, how to transform the fashions, the caption says, from 1965 into 1966. Elsewhere, below, the word city or ville straddles the seam between suspenders that won't slacken and the rigging of a movable dock crane. Throughout, a connotative reading connects the industrialized nature of mass housing to a range of social bonds, as well as to new materials and fasteners and accessories in mass-produced, ready-to-wear clothing. This is something I think we also see in the work of Jean-Luc Godard, and I'll just allude to that. But in 1966, 67, he's working on 2 or 3 things I know about her, which is his homage to the transformation of Paris during these years. Tonka and Leroux took much of their material from the popular fashion magazine Elle, which at the time featured a year-long reportage on new towns that were being constructed in Paris's suburbs, of the kinds that Godard was also filming in 2 or 3 things. In the pages of Elle, we also see that undergarments and suburban towers were routinely appearing within the same visual field. Yet here they are kept safely segregated by a vertical bar, in fact, just the thinnest of lines. And it's this line, in a sense, that I'm proposing that repression dismantles. This is what's being disassembled, collapsing the artificial distance between these extraneous elements into a new, more unstable connotative density. Such a condition was one in which the classic mechanisms of repression could no longer be identified in quite the same way. Such a collapsed condition could appear as one in which a building or a street was no more important than the disposable collision of sprays, clips, logos, and fashions that closed in around them. As if to contest that implication, the montage reasserts a subtle, if significant, difference. The visual friction between black and white and the tones of gray continues to mark a kind of difference between conflicting conceptual and optical registers, one in which the city and these new products remained in separate worlds, even if they appeared to sit within the same continuous surface. In their insistence on connotation and critical disassembly, such montage structures could be seen as counter-images to a system which members of the group saw as increasingly closed in on itself. Baudrillard's system of objects was one effort to describe such a total closure, even if it was never totally secure. As he pointed out, the system of objects was also a systematization of fragility. From the ephemerality of fashion, the febrility of objects designed to fall apart, and the repetition compulsions incited by serial production, a specter of disassembly haunts the system of objects. Baudrillard writes, "Once assembled and mounted, the components of a technical object imply a certain coherence, but such a structure is always vulnerable to the human mind. Held together from without by its function, it's purely formal for the psyche. The hierarchy of elements can be dismantled at any time." Articulated amidst the political and theoretical turbulence of the end of the 1960s, the rhetoric of disassembly that Utopie develops was something of an impossible balancing act. It refused both the traditional fixity demanded of architecture, but also it refused the programmed fungibility of industrial styling, wagering on a more profoundly unstable assemblage between techniques and culture. On the one hand, montage was a means for envisioning architecture's disassembly, its detachment from values of durability and permanence. And yet this very envisioning of architecture as assemblage, an assemblage that would be subject to flexible rearrangement, actually drew architecture closer to the logic of the commodity, a logic that emphasized ever greater disposability, of being designed to be used up and thrown out, of something that would be thoroughly adaptable to multiple and changing dispositifs. If the group's short-lived yet intense collaboration brought this contradiction to light more clearly than, say, the work of other groups, they certainly did not escape that contradiction. In fact, the group began to splinter and break up already in 1969. Yet the tensions surrounding disassembly were also tied to a faith in theoretical construction. The unstable fields of connotation in Utopie's montages and the literal instability of their pneumatic structures were vehicles for a larger intellectual project. It was a project that ultimately aimed to render architecture's disciplinary identity itself unstable by taking it apart in order to reassemble it otherwise. Architecture was understood neither as an art, a service, nor a technical instrument, but as a physical and theoretical assembly problem, one that sought to reflect on the workings of design in order to question how disciplinary limits were being drawn. I'll stop there. I went a little bit over, but thank you very much. Please, yeah.
And, oh, actually, you have this. Yes, I'm not sure if you know, but that's selfishly very interesting to me as well, because I've been looking at the history of design criticism around that same period, and in two ways my work intersects with yours. One is I've been looking at, from the other direction, people from England, basically, people like Richard Hamilton and Rainer Bannon examining the logic of the commodity and the expendability of mass-produced product design at that time. And Richard Hamilton, back in 1960, was also grading the magazine as a kind of, so he was looking at industrial design magazine over here, and basically breaking it up and recompositing it back in England. So that was kind of fun. And the other way is the Utopie gang all showed up at the Aspen Design Conference in 1970.
Right, yes.
And of course, Europe. And
yeah.
anyway.
Well, there's two interesting things there. I mean, it's interesting how these histories touch each other and interweave in certain ways. Banham actually he traveled to Paris to see the exhibition and wrote his first big piece on pneumatics right after that, called Monumental Windbags, which I think is sort of a sort of also a dig at the French and how much they had to say. But I mean, it's interesting to see the different positions. I mean, you have someone like Banham and Hamilton, who are so close in the 1950s, who put together the Man-Machine Motion exhibition in 55, 56, and are really willing to follow the sort of churning waves of expendability and obsolescence wherever they're going to lead. I mean, for them, that's an exciting prospect. It's almost type of neo-futurist in Banham's case, faith in technological change. On the other hand, you have a much more scientifically oriented design discourse, some coming out of places like the Hochschule für Gestaltung at figures like Tomás Maldonado, who are absolutely going in the opposite direction. They do not want to see expendability be the primary value. They're very suspicious of things like the Ford styling book as well. Maldonado writes about these types of styling books during these years. And for that reason, they want to move away from art towards science and actually developing more scientific methodologies for design. I think the Utopie gang are sort of in the middle. As architects, they're neither sort of like Hamilton in the world of art, being able to sort of create new tableaus out of design elements, nor are they running a design school like Maldonado, which aims to kind of sort of resist the market at some level, or to engage with the market on its own particular terms. So I think they're in between, and a very sort of odd and contradictory formation as well. So
I love how these worlds intersect.
Yeah.
Now, talking of intersecting worlds, this notion of the intricate task of taking things apart, which I loved in the way you kind of set up, and I wondered if you could just sort of talk off the top of your head about that as a possible tool and technique for design criticism. You know, I mean, you're talking about it in a sort of particular context here, and but presumably that works for architecture criticism too. Have you thought of it in that way as a kind of productive technique?
I haven't thought of it quite as explicitly in that way, but I think it actually very much is a technique for design writing and for architectural writing, in the sense that to understand something, once you've taken something apart, even if you haven't physically taken it apart, if you've mentally sort of tried to take apart the pieces of how something went together, you actually begin to understand it in reverse, in a way. You understand how all of those pieces were conceived from the outset. So there's a type of way in which understanding is itself modeled as a type of physical operation, one that actually connects to the way in which we take things apart or put things together. And you see that, in a sense, in the 1960s in a lot of writing. A writing that tries to actually get closer to its objects, tries to get almost at a sort of up to the skin of the object through description during these years.
This is the kind of writing I love.
Yeah. And in this case, the other thing that's interesting to me is that there's an expansion of the notion of writing as well during the 1960s, in which writing is not only meant or not only described any longer as a series of alphabetic notations on a page, but images are understood as writing, dance is understood as writing. There's an extension of that concept of writing. And so the way in which that expanded notion of writing, on the one hand, tied to structuralist criticism, and the way in which, in fact, the page is being put together and taken apart in different ways during these years, seems to be, part of the condition of possibility for these types of images.
It's funny, I was just thinking as well, it's almost could be used to describe your technique as a historian. I mean, the way you really get up close, that's how it came across to me, get up close to the skin of the object and sort of pulling it apart to see how it's made. I really appreciated your kind of, stripping away the layers of those images and taking us all the way to the machine of reproduction. Going a bit further, take us a bit more behind the scenes with that. I mean, that's a pretty amazing find to find that paste up of the montage there. Where are you finding this stuff? These archives?
That was in a box in a little farmhouse in Poitou-Charentes, which if people have been to France, has anybody been to Poitou-Charentes? It's where they make a lot of butter, where there are not a lot of people left, in fact, because like the United States, these rural areas have completely been drained. But one of the members, Isabelle Auricoste, actually moved there in the 1980s and actually took over a school that had been shut down and now runs it as her office. She's a landscape designer, works there and in Bordeaux. And she had these boxes sitting there which had not really been gone through for ages. And so I went down there with my colleague Jean-Louis Vialot. We published the translation of the Utopie writings, and just began going through the boxes and found all kinds of things, and one of which were some of the paste ups that they had kept. And they hadn't kept a lot. But it's very interesting because this is the type of material that typically would have been brought to the printer, photographed, and turfed. You never see it again. But looking at these things that somehow, by some accident of history, survived, actually begin to allow you to read the images differently. And so I think it's also a question for people doing design history in the future. What will remain of the infrastructure of the way in which we make images today, and in what way will those actually be available to people in the future? It's kind of an interesting question.
There won't be boxes in the French countryside.
Exactly, yeah.
Yes, exactly. Now, you told us a lot about the production of Utopie, and could you just tell us a bit about how it was used and read?
Yeah.
Like, who was reading this thing, and what would they have done with those kind of spreads? How would they have been... You gave us your reading.
Yeah.
But how would they have used that material?
Well, it's always hard to do reception theory for these little journals because they're so mercurial. They appear and they disappear. But for instance, there's material from... This is one of the interesting things about a comparative approach to these different groups. You can actually, if you look at them all together, you see how they're cutting out each other's magazines. So you see bits from Utopie actually appearing in Archigram, which have evidently been cut right out of the journal, right? And so you do see people actually treating them not as precious objects, but as repositories of imagery to then cut out and further recirculate. You also have a sense that there was a lot of conflict during these years around these journals. And so they were not only read and reproduced, they were sometimes attacked. And so Utopie was a group that sort of was on the extreme left within the Écoles des Beaux-Arts, but weren't on the same side as, say, the Maoist militants within the school. And the fact that they would dare engage in something like designing pneumatic furniture was seen as so reprehensible that these magazines were kind of attacked. And I remember one of the editors telling me a story once, not about this particular issue, but about another issue later in the 1970s. At the time, they would distribute these magazines directly to the bookshops. They would bring a pile, leave it, come back later, and pick up whatever money they had from sales. And this one particular issue was flying off the shelves. He went to the bookshop week after week and kept dropping off packets. And he's saying, who's buying all these? And in fact, it was a rival group that was buying them and destroying them. And so there's all kinds of interesting ways in which these physical journals were actually, read or destroyed, but they were the kind of currency of an intellectual life at this moment in time. And the bookshops were centers in ways that they aren't any longer. Or the few that heroically survive are, I would say, but the bookshop in large terms as a center has somehow disappeared.
All right, let's take some questions from our audience. First of all, I give preference to our students, and then we'll open up beyond that. Sure thing.
I'm wondering how you got interested in this topic, and especially to the level of driving out to find boxes in the French countryside. What triggered this?
Yeah, no, it's a long story, but one of the sources for my interest was really trying to go back to May '68 and to try and understand what role architects were playing in this sort of mythical event of May '68. And there's very little documentation in some respects. I mean, there's lots of documentation in others. But to understand exactly what was going on in those meetings and whatnot, we have some tracks, we have some pamphlets, but there was no extensive recording. So the journals then became extremely interesting to me to try and understand what role they were playing, what things they were debating during those years. And the more I looked at that magazine, or at least my first glance at that magazine, it was totally incomprehensible to me. I mean, I just didn't understand what was going on. And so part of the effort to read it is actually my own effort to try and enter that world and think in 1968, what did it mean to put all these things on the same page? So that's part of what led me to make that trip. And somehow to understand it also meant to understand how it was made and to understand paste-ups. And I'm of a generation that didn't use paste-ups, right? So I had to discover what a paste-up was. So, in a sense...
Somewhere I have them in a box. I actually do have paste-ups in a box somewhere. Yeah.
And so that was what was so interesting to me. Yeah. And, it seems that from my cursory knowledge, I think paste-ups and offset lithography are a really important role in the shift from older modes of typographic reproduction to desktop publishing in the 1980s and then Photoshop and Adobe after that. It's almost as if the transformation of offset litho gets incorporated into software through commands like cut and paste. And so to sort of question the way in which terms like cut and paste are used today is sort of also to do an archaeology of the way in which those devices have been naturalized for us as part of an interface, which means going back to the pages and going back to the paste-ups. Yeah.
And the photocopier period.
And the photocopier, which is a really interesting period and is sort of one that's actually... Copiers are around in the 60s, but they're not often used to make magazines. It's more like the sort of 70s and 80s when that technology comes to be used for magazines. So, yeah, but it's a really interesting one.
Okay, a couple more questions. All right, we can just do general questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's lovely.
If in this kind of trajectory from the kind of the interwar avant-garde, which is interested in engaging with industrial production and it's kind of like industrial images like photography and things and the kind of political stakes of going into the factory. And then in the 60s you have this kind of as you said, this double layering of that same modernist industrial mode and this other thing of media, which is images, but it's also kind of a semiotic system. And so and then with the Herzog and there are more things you see now I mentioned how now kind of urban space and image regime is not overlaying industry or even media as much as like finance, which is like completely all semiotic, all abstract, all like it doesn't live anywhere, like annihilates space, and that it's made in the computer, which has to use these metaphors of like old production to allow its users to like imagine how they're working in this completely abstract 1 to 0 space. I guess the question is like how are these engagements with these different kinds of systems that show up differently? What are the kind of things
It's a big question. I mean, but it's a good one. I mean, I think for me, one of the symptoms of, let's say, the naturalization of montage is the degree to which we perceive it less and less as a construction, right? And so it's only through certain moments where we actually begin to get towards what might be the equivalent of a paste up in the era of computing, right? Maybe it's through forms of degradation or through other forms of operation that leave their trace in the digital image, in the texture of the digital image. But in terms of the larger trajectory, the kind of simple point I wanted to make was simply to hold on to some of these older terms, and that in fact they have within them, or they harbor within them, some trace of what it meant initially for somebody to think of a photograph as an industrial material, right? Or in the case of collage, to think of an image as a thing glued, a thing whose substance was in fact glue, not vision, right? And that afterlife, the sort of long overhang of those terms can actually prompt us to read these images a little more carefully and a little more specifically. And I think the terms for our own period are going to be different. I'll leave it to others to think about what those terms might be. But I tried to suggest in the 1950s and 60s, with this shift from a regime of, say, industrial letterpress, which was still being used in the 20s for much of the kind of Dada work and even for the Soviet work, to a more generalized litho condition, you have, in a sense, terms like démontage in the French context, which are being used both for ideological purposes, the dismantling of ideas, the demountability of structures, and the taking apart of, say, visual systems. In our own time, there's bound to be different terms. But I'm increasingly interested in the kind of sort of afterlife of these printed forms in a period where we're constantly told that print is disappearing, and in fact its afterlife is still sort of powerfully with us in ways that I think are quite structuring. They've structured our perception. They may not be the literal mode of reproduction for things, but they still structure our perception of images in ways that I think are powerful. Right.
Together art and technology.
Yeah.
And Klaus Oldenburg's Pneumatics and Ed Kimo's Montages.
Yeah.
This was an interesting culmination of something, but it had something to do, I think, with what you're talking about in terms of pneumatics and its symbolism.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
No, it's a dense moment at the end of the 1960s where all of a sudden you have artists, you have scientists, you have architects, you have designers working on and working with pneumatic material, often in quite different ends. Oldenburg, to bring up a Yale example, made his monumental lipstick ascending on caterpillar tracks, which was this sort of guerrilla sculpture that was commissioned by a bunch of Yale students and a Yale professor to place it in the library plaza at Beinecke. They put it there in a May morning in order to create this sort of pushback against the university, in order to create a speaker's platform there. And it was a tank with a pneumatic lipstick that never quite worked properly, but served as a kind of agitprop function. And I think pneumatics are connected to agitprop in certain moments. They're also connected to a kind of new formula of consumerism, the sort of the disposable couch, the inflatable bed, all of this. But they also, I think, speak to a particular moment, a moment in which plastics are in fact becoming cheap and readily available. It's sort of the implosion, actually the explosion point of oil being so available and so ready. Right before in the 1970s it begins to reverse direction. So it also speaks to a larger moment of say, feeling that growth was limitless, and the pneumatics, its ability to sort of fill itself with air and disappear and blow away, also seems to call back that kind of moment of the 60s where it did feel like growth was going to go on in an unlimited way. So today it carries a very different feeling because we look back on these things and see something quite different. Yes, we see the ludic aspect, but we also see the dark aspect, I think, of pneumatics. And in fact, we're beginning to see the sort of enclosure of society within these envelopes in ways that is dark. So it remains a kind of charged symbol of that period for me in that sense.
Okay, well, I'll ask a last question before we go. I just was curious to hear a little bit more about your teaching practice and what it's like and how it affects the way you teach, to be teaching architecture history in a history of art department.
Right.
What that does. Because you have ended up doing this kind of image analysis, I
Yeah.
think. So I just wonder if that's part of that. that experience.
Well, I was doing that kind of analysis before I got to an art history department, because initially I had studied art history in my master's degree, so I had been contaminated fairly early. It might be why I'm in an art history department today. But the teaching is it's very good. I end up teaching lectures to undergraduates, often who have never studied architecture before. So that's an incredible privilege and challenge as well. But the graduate seminars I have are actually an interesting mix of students coming from the architecture school, students coming from art history, students coming from the design program at the art school. And I've tried to organize those around material at Beinecke Library. So the seminars in particular, I like to organize around digging into actual physical boxes, so to find more paste ups and things like that. And Beinecke happens to have a rich trove of material which has been collected under the theme of the post-war avant-garde. And they've collected material from France, from Italy, from the Eastern Bloc, from England, both not material necessarily related to architecture, but also to art and to political movements. And that material has served as a rich trove for a couple of seminars now, including one on the sort of fringe elements of the Situationist International, because they have a really great collection of material from Situationist groups that were somehow kicked out of the Situationist movement. The Dutch figures, the German figures, the Scandinavian figures, the Italian figures, the English figures, all of whom began to be attracted to the Situationists, joined, and then were kicked out. So you can actually look through the archives and see this other narrative of this group by looking at all of the other movements who took the name but never somehow were allowed to stay in the center. So that's where the teaching is now, and hopefully we'll be able to continue working through some of that material, because it's frankly just been collected and it's just sort of opening up. And so also for anybody else who's interested in that period and that material, think of the Beinecke as a resource, because it has great material, and you don't need to be a Yale affiliate. You can just go and make an appointment and see this material. So yeah.
Well, to invite you all to come and have a glass of fresh wine with us in the next room, but before we do, please join me in thanking again Craig Buckley.